This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. Welcome to another episode. I'm Steve Richards. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most dramatic, overlooked, and fiercely contested campaigns of World War II. Joining me is renowned military historian, former intelligence officer, and prolific author Anthony Tucker Jones, who has written more than 50 books and is a regular voice in magazines, media, television, and radio, too. His latest work, Rhineland, Hitler's Last Defense, 1944 to 1945, offers a gripping retelling of the desperate German struggle to hold the West Bank of the Rhine, a battle fought in the shadow of the inevitable collapse of the Third Reich. What sets this book apart is Anthony's detailed reconstruction of the campaign from the German perspective, from the ordinary soldier all the way up to Hitler's high command. I'm happy to have Anthony Tucker Jones join me here on the Speaking of Writers podcast. Welcome.
Hey, Steve, thank you very much for having me on.
It's great to have you here. So, for viewers and listeners unfamiliar with the Rhineland's role in World War II, what was the Rhineland and why was it so crucial, Anthony, to Hitler and Nazi Germany?
Well, for me, and one of the reasons why I wrote the book is I always kind of think the Second World War actually started in the Rhineland. The kind of popular narrative is the Second World War starts with Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939. But actually, Hitler tested the waters in 1936 when he remilitarized the Rhineland. It was a region that he was familiar with. He'd been there during the First World War. By his own admission, he first set eyes on it in 1914 and loved the region, allegedly went on holiday there once a year. But in 1936, he moved when he was when he'd taken over Germany. In 1936, he moved the German military back into the Rhineland. And the Rhineland, along with the Saarland and the Ruhr, they had been demilitarized at the end of the First World War. And by 1936, Hitler had already got the Saarland and the Ruhr back. So it was only the Rhineland that was still demilitarized. And up to a point, it had been occupied by the British and the French, but they had withdrawn some time earlier. So it effectively meant the Rhineland just didn't have any German troops in there. And one of the reasons that Hitler wanted to remilitarize it was he wanted to move Nazi Germany's defenses further west, principally because it would give greater air defense depth to the Ruhr, Germany's main industrial region built around the Ruhr River. So that's what sparked his sort of strategic need to do that. But it also tested the waters because by doing that, by sending his troops over the River Rhine and onto the western banks, he violated the terms of the Versailles Treaty, which had been signed after the First World War. And for a very tense 48 hours, he had to wait and see what Britain and France were going to do. And by his own admission, he was prepared to withdraw if they'd shown any political desire to flex military muscles to drive him out. He would have withdrawn. Excuse me, but they didn't. Britain and France at that stage did not have the stomach to pick a fight with Hitler, particularly over the Rhineland, which was German territory anyway. I think one British newspaper characterized it, well, it's like him going back into his back garden, so there's no real harm done. But of course, what it signaled to Hitler was Britain and France were not going to pick a fight with him when he started nibbling other bits. And in fact, after the dust had settled and he'd reoccupied the Rhineland, he made this statement where he said, well, all of Germany's territorial ambitions are now satisfied, which, of course, as we know, was a complete lie because he had his eye on Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and then obviously Russia. But I say it signaled to him that he probably would get away with taking over parts of Europe, and that France and Britain would not, would not act. So in many ways, the Second World War starts with the Rhineland because that's the first test of British and French resolve. And obviously, it's another 3 years before they decide that they're going to go to war with Germany over Poland. But also, crucially for the Germans, it's pretty much where the Second World War ends. Obviously, on the Eastern Front, it's with the collapse of the Eastern Front and the Red Army ending up in Berlin. But for the Western Allies, so for Britain, America, and the French, uh, the Rhineland really is the culmination of the Allied campaign in Northwest Europe. For Hitler, he has a strategic decision to make when it comes to late 1944 after the German collapse in Normandy, is how is he going to defend Nazi Germany? Is he going to fight on the western bank of the Rhine or on the eastern bank of the Rhine? And that's kind of what informs the book. I wanted to try and get the reader into the German mindset as to why Hitler fights the battles that he does in the closing months of the Second World War.
I want to stay in late 1944. How desperate was the situation from the German perspective at this point in the war?
Well, ironically, actually, it's not that desperate. So we kind of think in terms of the German collapse in Normandy, the German hasty withdrawal from the south of France following the landings there with Operation Dragoon. So in France, the Germans are in full retreat. They get to the Seine River in northern France, abandon most of their equipment, and it looks like a complete disaster for the Germans. And of course, Montgomery then underestimates them by conducting Operation Market Garden in September. So, within weeks of the German collapse, Monty comes up with this daring plan to bounce the Rhine in the Netherlands, so the lower Rhine, by capturing Arnhem. And he kind of thinks, his assessment is that the German armed forces were spent power, which of course they are not. So he comes a cropper there with Market Garden. As we know, Arnhem ends up as a complete disaster. And Monty suffers a major setback. But while all that's going on, the Germans conduct a series of rearguard holding actions, principally at the German city of Aachen and also in the Hürtgen forest. Because what the Germans actually do is they carry out, not many people are aware of this, they carry out what they call the miracle in the West. So although they've been defeated in Normandy, the bulk of the manpower from their armored divisions that have been defeated in Normandy, almost 100,000 men, escape. So they get back over the river, and Hitler withdraws them into Germany. And thanks to Albert Speer, the Nazi, armaments and munitions minister, his factories churn out enough equipment not only to re-equip 5th Panzer Army, which has escaped from Normandy, but also to help a new one, 6th Panzer Army. And Hitler's plan is he's going to husband those. He'll keep them back, and he'll fight a whole series of rearguard actions on the Western Front while those armies are built up, because his plan is in the winter of 45, he's going to launch a surprise offensive through the Ardennes with a view of capturing Antwerp, because if he feels if he can get his hands on Antwerp, that will slow down the Allied war effort on the Western Front. The Allies had only just reopened the port in, I'm going from memory here, I think something like late November. So it had taken them for ages to open up Antwerp as a supply route. And in the meantime, they've been conducting this thing called the Red Ball Express, which is driving lorry convoys, from French ports all the way across Northwest Europe to the front lines. Not an ideal solution. So Hitler thinks he can buy himself time. He has it in his mind that Britain and America will fall out, and Britain and America will also fall out with the Russians, and he can get some sort of negotiated settlement. So the idea is he's going to launch this surprise attack, which we know is the Battle of the Bulge, take Antwerp. Once he's done that, he's then going to turn his panzer armies to the east, or the Eastern Front, and he's going to conduct a similar counteroffensive against the Red Army in Hungary, principally to defend the approaches to Vienna and Austria, but also to try and cling on to Hungary's oil fields for as long as possible, because obviously they're vital to the German war effort.
Your book is told from the German point of view, something rarely explored in depth. Why was it important for you to frame the story this way?
Growing up, I was a big fan of Liddell Hart's book called The Other Side of the Hill, which was this whole series of interviews he'd conducted with senior German commanders at the end of the Second World War. Now, as we say in English, I don't know whether it's an American expression as well, but you have to take those with a pinch of salt. They need to be dealt with caution, because obviously those German commanders were looking at their legacy and how history would view them. So they tended to have a habit of blaming Hitler for absolutely everything. Saying, well, we were shorn of the initiative. He wouldn't let us make any decisions. But I found it, fascinating to put yourself, as Little Hart called it, the other side of the hill, to put yourself in their mindset. So Rhineland actually is part of a trilogy. I've done that with the Battle for Arnhem. I looked at what the Germans did to achieve victory there. And then I also have done a book called Hitler's Winter, which looked at the Battle of the Bulge, again, from the Germans' perspective. What on earth possessed Hitler to do that? Because I always argue, strategically, Hitler should have kept those panzer armies on the east bank of the Rhine and on the western banks of first the Vistula and the Oder, to slow down the Allies on both the western and the eastern fronts. He didn't do that. I mean, obviously, he helped speed up the end of the war by throwing away his rejuvenated armies with those offensives in the Ardennes and in Hungary. But that's what kind of inspired me. Is I thought, there are lots of books that tend to look at all the famous campaigns, particularly in Northwest Europe. They always tend to do them, from Montgomery's point of view, or Patton, or Bradley, or General Patch, all those senior commanders. On the British side, General Dempsey obviously was second British Army. So it was kind of what I wanted to do. I said the key thing really was, why did Hitler decide to defend the west bank of the Rhine? Because logically, he should have put his rejuvenated forces and those armies that we were drawing on the east bank and make the Allies pay a heavy price for getting over the river. I mean, the Rhine is a major river. It crosses the whole of Europe, runs from the Swiss Alps all the way down to the North Sea. So it's a long waterway. During the winter, of course, it's in full flood. It's very wide, so to get across it's difficult. But of course, Hitler had this mindset where he refused to give up ground all the time. And also, in the terms of somewhere like Aachen and the Hürtgen, it took the American army until late October to take Aachen, which is the first German city to fall to the Allies. It was important for Hitler that he held it because it screened the approaches to the Rhine, but also it tied down American troops. And then likewise, the defense of the Hürtgen Forest, which it took the American army until the end of to mid-December to clear, again, distracted Eisenhower. Both those operations distracted Eisenhower while Hitler is rejuvenating and building up 5th Panzer Army and 6th Panzer Army ready for his Ardennes offensive. So you can understand why what to us actually look like fairly minor battles are quite important for the Germans, because it's keeping certainly the American army distracted. The problem comes really once the Ardennes offensives failed. It's at that point really Hitler should have withdrawn his armies over the Rhine, but he doesn't. He keeps them on. He keeps them on the in the West Bank, in the Rhineland, in the Saar-Palatinate, and in the Alsace, the sort of three main German regions west of the river. He keeps his armies there, which ultimately results in disaster.
As a former intelligence officer, how did your background influence the way you approach the operational and strategic aspects of this history?
That's a good question. I think mainly it's analysing the decision making, and it's trying to put yourself in the German general's shoes without trying to second guess them. When you're making judgments on their behaviour, it should always be well informed. If you're going to make a judgment or a statement on their behaviour, it should be informed by what they've done, or if you've got access to written records by them, by their memoirs. So someone like Field Marshal Kesselring, who sort of takes over halfway through the Rhineland campaign, he wrote a book after the war. So when you've got access to their memoirs and what they said, it helps you, judge their actions, I think, much more accurately. So it's that sort of analytical skill, I think. Also, I think probably it's a question of, and I'm sure most writers do it, it's leaving no stone unturned.
Yes.
You've got to, I always say as a historian, your job is to wade through a lot of information and material and then distill it for the reader. and hopefully make sure it's a damn good read, because that's foremost, as a writer, I write books that I would like to read. And I hope I take the reader on an interesting and informed journey. I try and guide them. There's also an element, of course, allowing the reader to make up their own minds about what happened. But I say it's a historian's job really is in many ways to distill, what's happened, and try and make sense of it. Again, one of the things for doing an overarching book looking at the whole of the fighting along the Rhine was traditionally the books are separate, so you'll have a book on Operation Plunder with Monty's Rhine crossing in late March. You can find books on the Battle for the Colmar Pocket, in February 45. Likewise, Hergen Forest. There are lots of books that look at the separate elements of the campaign, but they treat those battles separately. Again, with Monty's Operation Veritable, clearing out the Reichswald and the Hotwall forests before he gets to the Rhine. Again, they're treated separately. So the sort of analytical element, if you like, without making it sound too dry, is to distill it. What put it all together. What does it mean? What's going on, if you like. Because I'm a great believer in, with history, you need context. So all the time, what's going on either side of whatever you're looking at. And I think that's quite important.
Anthony, with more than 50 books behind you now, where does Rhineland sit in your own body of work, and why was this story so important to tell now?
Well, of course, we've just had the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, so it seemed a good time. I say that the fascination always tends to be, certainly in the UK with the end of the Second World War, it tends to focus on Berlin, because it's such a climactic battle, and Hitler goes down. Well, he doesn't go down fighting because obviously he commits suicide, but he forces the garrison to resist beyond all points of reason. So it's sort of a gripping battle, as the Red Army gets closer and takes the Seelau Heights. So the focus, people tend to think of the end of the Second World War being in Berlin, whereas actually on the Western Front, it's in the Ruhr pocket. And that's always treated as a bit of a footnote. But Field Marshal Model, commander of Army Group B, becoming trapped in the Ruhr pocket, by mid-April 1945, it signals that all organised resistance on the Western Front by the Germans has come to an end. Because Model basically conducts this campaign to try and slow down the Allies from getting to the Rhine with an arm tied behind his back, because Hitler won't allow him to make any tactical withdrawals. Hitler keeps on insisting that they counterattack when they don't have the resources to do this. Even when they're trapped in the Rhine pocket, Hitler won't, because by that point Hitler's focus is on Berlin. He won't allow Model to break out. So that what happens there in the Ruhr, it tends to be overlooked. People don't. Whereas in reality, the Germans lose around 320,000 troops in that pocket. So it's an enormous calamity for them.
He's Anthony Tucker Jones. His new book is Rhineland, Hitler's Last Defense, 1944 to 45. It is available now, an essential read for anyone who wants to understand one of the last frantic and defining battles of the European war through the eyes of the people who fought it. For more info on Anthony Tucker Jones, he's got a website, atuckerjones.com. You can check out more of his work, his media appearances, and his many books wherever you get your history. And Anthony, finally, what is next for you and your writing?
Currently working on a book called Nazi Hunters. So it's looking at how the Allied powers dealt with the issue of war criminals at the end of the Second World War. And my starting point really is post-Nuremberg trials. They're covered quite extensively as they should be. But it wasn't a subject until I started writing the book I knew a great deal about, and it's just quite shocking, really. It's a story of negligence. It's a story of national self-interest. It's a story of indifference, mainly because, of course, with the gathering clouds of the Cold War, both America and the Soviet Union they conducted, in America's case, things like Operation Paperclip, where they hoovered up um, Nazi scientists, and they were taken to America, obviously, to work on the American rocket program. But also in Germany, a lot of Nazi war criminals that had served in German intelligence organizations were hoovered up by the Western powers because they had access to East Germany and they were needed to spy on the Soviets. So a lot of people got off scot-free when they shouldn't have done. So, with Nuremberg, we had obviously all the senior Hitler's inner circle facing trial, but lots of people ended up scattered. They famously went to Latin America, to Argentina and Brazil and Paraguay and various places. Some of them ended up in the Middle East. They fled to Egypt and Syria. So they ended up scattered all over the world. So the book kind of looks at the various organizations that sort of led this, I don't want to say crusade, that's the wrong word, but held the view that, justice doesn't expire. There's no expiry date on war crimes. And particularly in recent years, up and even in the noughties, there have been a number of trials. So yeah, quite a fascinating book and sort of an adjunct, if you like, to the books I've written on military campaigns. This kind of looks at the aftermath, if you like.
So that's coming next from Anthony Tucker Jones. You can enjoy Rhineland now, Hitler's Last Defense, 1944 to 1945. Thank you so much for joining me.
Steve, been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you. And this is the Speaking of Writers podcast. Like it, share it, subscribe to it. Write a review. I will talk to you again next time. I'm Steve Richards.